in policies, particularly in developing countries with large population. There is something called gray correlation analysis in policy analysis. It's largely a modeling analysis when researchers, policy analysts deal with policy synthesis, which was very complex. Gray proposed a method to discuss the obstacles when acquiring data for policy making and compare several commonly used quantitative analysis tools. It is actually conducting analysis on large amount of evidence that is already collected, but there is a lot of complexity in synthesizing evidence. So Gray proposes correlation analysis method. This is actually modeling method. I have gone through that. There are a lot of equations, mathematics into this Gray correlation method. Has certain advantage in no limit to sample size and no requisition for sample data to conform to typical distribution rules. So it uses a lot of modeling approach when data is constrained by sample size or methodology, etc. The Gray correlation analysis help in synthesizing evidence by conducting a lot of this modeling exercise. The Gray correlation analysis can explore the key influencing factor and their interrelationship so as to provide more reliable basis for policy formulation. So this is the last about evidence synthesis. For example, evidence synthesis method. Suppose if you have a question in terms of methods and evidence synthesis, this is an example how when you are dealing with an evidence synthesis and looking at data. This is an illustrative example how you could look for a resolution of that question. Do experimental and non-experimental evaluations. That is evidence synthesis. You have experimental data and non-experimental data, observational data, research evidence. Do experimental or non-experimental evaluation give different answers about the effectiveness of a government-funded program? The policy question or the policy choice is a government-funded training program. And the research, the evidence synthesis, the researcher has both experimental and non-experimental evaluation. And he compares experimental and non-experimental evaluation, whether they give different answers to find out if both of them give different answers. This is in a way to find the effectiveness of the policy choice. Policy analysis used meta-analysis to investigate whether random assignment experimental evaluations of voluntary government-funded training programs for the disadvantaged have produced different conclusions than non-experimental evaluation, that is without random assignments. The results suggested that experimental and non-experimental evaluation yielded similar conclusions about the effectiveness of the training program. They did not vary much. But the estimates of the average effects for the youth and possibly for men might have been larger in experimental studies. So what the study showed that the experimental study showed, the evidence showed, the findings were similar, but the findings of experimental showed larger effects for a youth population and possibly larger effect for men. So it gives a clue as to where to focus the policy. So as such, experimental data suggests that this particular policy option has greater effect for youth and for men. That means that the policymaker has to, he doesn't have to worry about youth and men as the policy is going to have its own effect, but the policymaker also has to worry about the other group of population, the other category of the population, possibly women and other age categories. So that is an answer in terms of this policy synthesis analysis using different methods or multiple methods of policy analysis. So we will now move on to policy analysis findings. A policy analysis finding is a statement that presents final results of evidence analysis. Every finding is a statement, a clear, concise statement, but not all statements qualify as a finding for a policy or doesn't provide a policy statement. For a statement to be analytical finding, it must provide an interpretation, explanation of evidence provided in the analysis and identify an issue that can and should be addressed through a policy decision. A finding could be, for instance, a problem that needs an immediate solution a new development that creates opportunity for improvement in policy or a statistical trend pattern. We often look at data and we find very unique statistical pattern or trend that invites further research, but also that may eventually lead to policy options, policy choice. Common to all findings is that if left unaddressed, they lead to a missed opportunity for policy and improvement. That particular finding may have lead to a phenomenal amount of improvement for the people, development for a development opportunity. There are possibilities that sometimes, many times, policy decisions are possible parachute conclusions and decisions. This happened. This happened before. I don't know if it's happening now also. Ideally, I mean, this as policy analysts, as policy researchers, we need to be aware that many times policy conclusions, they are not based on evidence base. That is a real challenge also. Ideally, analytical conclusions and policy recommendation would emerge from data analysis and would be corroborated by evidence on which the analysis relies. But in practice, the reverse can happen. Priorities for action might have been set in advance. Many policy action happened during COVID pandemic time, we know, without maybe a lot of evidence synthesis or hard evidence, on the basis of considerations or humanitarian or third-party interests without proper evaluation and verification. Many times it happened. Such situations do not mean that ex post analysis of problems targeted by such parachute decision is necessarily correct or impossible. Sometimes it may be the only choice, the parachute conclusions, but there is always possibility for the policy analysts and researchers to make analysis of such decisions. Such situations are likely to put those in charge of analysis under pressure and could affect their neutrality and increase the risk of manipulation and bias. Move on to policy recommendation. In general, recommendations are actions proposed on the basis of the analytical findings and aim to prevent a problem, solve a problem, benefit from an opportunity, prepare for future developments. Policy recommendations are pieces of policy advice or statement to recipients who are stakeholders who have the authority to make decisions. They are inseparable from analytical findings and suggest an option for action. In this sense, they are among the key means through which policy decisions are made. Now, these are the criteria. What are the criteria for policy recommendations? The standard criteria for making policy recommendations from evidence synthesis or from policy conclusions. The first is effectiveness. Does the given policy alternative result in achievement of a valued outcome? There is an incremental outcome, and is there a technical rationality? That should be one of the criteria. Number two is efficiency, the amount of effort that is needed to produce a given level of effectiveness. The economic rationality, cost effectiveness. Third is adequacy, the extent to which any given level of effectiveness satisfies the needs, values, or opportunity that gave rise to the problem. These include fixed cost and variable cost effectiveness, maximizing effectiveness, that is type 1. Number two is fixed effectiveness and variable cost, that is type 2, minimize cost. Number 4 is variable cost and variable effectiveness, that is type 3, increase efficiency. Number 4 is fixed cost and fixed effectiveness. Type 4 is do nothing. If you have closely followed the previous 2 lectures, we often discuss these 4 types of the cost and benefit evaluation in policy choices. In continuation of criteria for policy recommendation, equity, that is the most important. Stratification, you're coming to the point of stratification. The distribution of effect and effort among different groups in society, that is legal and social rationality. So that refers to maximizing individual welfare, protecting the minimum welfare, maximizing net welfare, and maximizing redistributive welfare in terms of that policy option. The next is responsiveness. It should satisfy needs, preferences, values of particular population, target groups. And the last is appropriateness. The last criteria is appropriateness, the value of worth of a program's objectives and the tenability of assumptions underlying objectives. So we move on to policy communication. with the last part of our discussion today. Policy making, of course, involves both science and art. The science is policy analysis, research analysis, evidence synthesis, and the art is communication, effective communication, clear, concise communication. So that is what makes policy communication. Therefore, evidence for policy making can take several forms. Research is most likely to influence policy development through an extended process of communication and continuing interaction. In part, the research policy interface is made more complex by the nature of scientific information, which is often vast, uneven in quality, and inaccessible to policymakers. Policymakers operate on a different hierarchy of evidence than scientists, researchers, leaving the two groups to live the so-called parallel universe. This is very common. People talk about this. The incorporation of quantitative evidence within compelling story can provide powerful leveler in the policy process. I talked about this, the combining quantitative evidence with a powerful narrative story. Studies from communication field have examined the effectiveness of using statistical data versus stories, narrative stories, persuading policymakers to opt for a particular policy which will contribute to development. Policymakers are busy people who are often juggling many different projects, priorities at a given point of time. They are constantly bombarded with policy recommendations from competing constituencies with a diverse set of perspectives. Therefore, policymakers do not have the time to develop deep subject matter expertise or even create original policy proposals. Instead, they focus on being able to quickly learn the subject material so that they can evaluate the external requests and decide which should be acted on. Target-based communication, that is a very effective way of communicating, could enhance policy effectiveness and contribute to strengthen the stakeholders' trust, which is crucial to guarantee the credibility of their policies. When presenting to an audience that is busy or distracted, researchers must communicate as effectively as possible in the limited time or word count available and follow the recommendation below. One of the recommendations, put your bottom line in the front. Policymakers often evaluate the utility of conservation or document within the first minute. Instead of slowly building the main conclusion, we often in research we come to the bottom line. We always the main point of our story always want to give at the end the conclusion. But the policymaker may not read through the whole document. So in policy communication, always try to make the focal point, the main point of your policy. You start with that should be the starting point. Instead of slowly building the main conclusion as you would in an academic paper, it's best to lead with what you want them to know and know what then work backwards from there. Number two is be clear and concise. Policymakers tend not to read document longer than a single page or listen to a talk that is longer than 10 or 15 minutes. So therefore, every word count when you are interacting with the policymakers. Make recommendations specific. The easier you can make it for a policymaker to implement recommendation, the more likely it is that they will act on it. The best recommendation are the ones that tell a policymaker exactly what they should do the moment they walk up to the meeting, all the way through the final implementation. Avoid discussing research methods. That is very important in policy communications because policymakers don't have time to read methods. Find the right analogy. This is very important.